Imagine walking into a classroom where the students are the ones driving the discussion, where curiosity and collaboration have replaced rote memorization. A place where traditional education has been turned on its head and the power of learning is placed directly in the hands of those who seek it.
Now we live in an information age, so information is ubiquitous. So why do we force students to come to a theater-like auditorium to sort of listen to the professor read the textbook to them?
Today's guest on Into the Impossible has turned this fantasy into a reality. Meet the one and only Eric Mazur, a pioneer whose radical approach to education is not only changing the way we learn, but also the way we think, collaborate, and succeed.
You're not going to learn to play the piano by going to concert hall listening to famous pianists playing the piano. You got to roll up your sleeves and play the piano.
In this thought-provoking conversation, we explore the past, present, and future of education with an emphasis on peer instruction and artificial intelligence. So let's go right into it and talk about peer instruction. I am going to be teaching a cosmology class, which I've taught on and off for 20 years as a professor here at UC San Diego. And I've never felt I've done a great job. I get decent reviews, but I always feel like it could be better. I always leave feeling I'm disappointed, I've failed. And I always, think back that really education hasn't changed much in 1,000 years. And so how does peer instruction, potentially provide a benefit for educators like me and for the students that are listening? We have hundreds of thousands of students that listen to this podcast. So how can peer instruction help me and help them?
Well, maybe we should first explain what peer instruction is, because I'm not assuming that everybody knows, right?
Right.
My background is not very dissimilar to yours. When I joined the faculty here 40 years ago, believe it or not, and I was asked to teach the large intro physics course, I didn't know any better than lecturing. I had been lectured, and I sort of very naively assumed, that's how I learned physics, and that's how I will teach. The question about how I should teach didn't even come up in my mind. And to make matters worse, even though I think deep down I knew that the lecture wasn't working, I'll come back to that in just a second. The feedback I was receiving was extremely positive. I got high evaluations for my lectures. The students passed difficult exams. So that only reinforced this misconception that we learn by lecturing. Now, let me back up for a moment. When I was a beginning student at Leiden University in the Netherlands, I wanted to become an astronomer, and I enrolled in the large introductory astronomy course. And, within 6 weeks, I decided astronomy is not for me. And in part, it was actually because of the lecturing, which was deadening and, which was essentially reciting facts rather than really thinking about the beauty of astronomy. But then when I started teaching, I'd forgotten all of that, and I did it to my students. And it wasn't until the early 1990s, actually 1990 exactly, after having taught for 6 years, that I discovered that my award-winning teaching, quote unquote, was really not accomplishing anything. I gave my students a pre-test and then a post-test to look at how they would answer some daily life questions about Newton's laws. So no equations, nothing. It really was asking just in words about interpretation. In fact, when I'd read the test, I thought this is too simple for my class. But then I saw that people had collected data that showed that students didn't learn anything. So I went, no way, that's not going to be true in my class. And then I gave it to my class. And one of the very first things that happened was that one student raised her hand and she asked me, Professor Mazur, how should I answer these questions? According to what you taught me or according to the way I usually think about these things? I was totally flabbergasted. I just had I didn't even understand the question, so to speak. I didn't know how to answer it. And by the time the test had been completed, it was clear that yes, my students liked my lectures, and yes, they passed exams, but they had not even internalized the most basic concepts, Newton's law. They were still Aristotelian thinkers. So that gave me pause. And to make a very long story short, sort of by accident, I discovered, in spite of literature that has pointed this out for many, many years, that rather than teaching by telling, what we should really do is teaching by questioning. Because education is not just the transfer of information. Before Gutenberg, or maybe before the Industrial Revolution, when books were not a commodity, the only way to transfer information from one generation to the next was through the lecture. In fact, the word lecture means a reading, ironically. But now we live in an information age, so information is ubiquitous. So why do we force students to come to a theater-like auditorium to sort of listen to the professor read the textbook to them? You're not going to learn to play the piano by going to concert hall listening to a famous pianist playing the piano. You got to roll up your sleeves and play the piano. Or you're not going to learn, to become a chef by watching, Chef's Table on Netflix. You got to actually be in the kitchen and roll up your sleeve and cook. Same for physics. Watching a professor talk about physics is not going to make you a physicist. You got to roll up your sleeves, or in this case, really use your brain and think like a physicist. So I thought, in class up to now, I've really been focusing on this first step of education, which is information transfer. And then I left the more important second part, making sense of that information to my students. We really flipped that around. So in 1990, I came up, I didn't call it the flipped classroom, it was the idea of flipping that around, telling my students, read my notes, read the textbook, and then in class, I'm going to help uncover misconceptions you have about this by basically teaching you through questioning rather than telling. Nothing new, of course, because Socrates already said we should teach by questioning. So the way I do it is I ask a question, and I try to ask the question so that it challenges about half of the students. I want no more than 70% desired answers and no more than 30% undesired. I say desired, undesired rather than correct, incorrect, because there might be people who are in the humanities, others where the word correct is not as applicable as it is in the sciences. So I have them commit to an answer. Now I don't use technology because I find the technology distraction. I simply have the students put their hand on their chest, indicating their choice, or write their answer down on a little piece of paper. Either way is fine. So if it's a multiple choice question, I can use 1 finger, 2 fingers, 3 fingers, 4 or 5. I try to limit it to 5 choices. And I tell them you all have to put your hand on your chest at the same time, showing which choice you've made with your fingers. And I tell them that if they don't do that, I will come to them, put the microphone in their face, and they have to tell the whole room. So they quickly slap their hands on their finger, on their chest. Then, after they've committed to an answer, I say, now find a person around you who has a different answer and try to convince that person that you are right and he or she is wrong. Okay? Chaos erupts, okay? Students stand up because they can't find somebody who has a different opinion right around them. They start talking. I mean, I frequently teach classes with up to 200 people. Everybody starts talking. The interesting thing that happens is that very quickly the students zoom in on the answer that I want them to focus on. And in the beginning, I was really surprised about that. But imagine you have 2 students next to each other, John and Mary. Mary has the right answer because she gets it. John does not. On average, Mary is more likely to convince John than the other way around. That's, the sort of the power of logic, if you want. But that's not the important point. The important point of pre-instruction is this. Mary is more likely to convince John than Professor Mazur because she has only recently learned it. She's not, affected by what Steven Pinker calls the curse of knowledge, or Susanna Ambrose calls the expert blind spot. She understands what John's difficulties are. Professor Mazur has taught it so many times, has understood it so long ago that he no longer remembers the difficulties that a beginning learner has. When I saw that, I thought, wow, I have to do this every time in my class. So essentially, they talk to each other, convince each other. I poll them again. And if the initial number of or percentage of correct answers is between 30 and 70%, it's not unlikely to go to 100%. And then wrap up with an explanation, either from the students or from me. And then the cycle repeats until class time is up. And by now, if you go to Google Scholar and you type in peer instruction, you'll find thousands of papers of people who have collected data in different disciplines. I always have people come to me, how do you use peer instruction in art history? I don't know, I'm a physicist, I don't teach history, but you Google art history peer instruction or art history veterinary medicine, and wow, you find articles on it. So that's in a nutshell what peer instruction is, and I think I touched upon the point of why it works for the students. It works for the students because they get an explanation in their own terms.
I love that way of thinking about it, but at the same time, I feel threatened, Eric, because I'm looking up Harvard's tuition. It's $57,261. It's outpacing inflation over time, and this is on the SoFi.com website, so it has to be true. It's got up a factor of more than double since actually, it's got up triple since you began teaching, double since I began teaching. And UC San Diego is not that much different, so I don't mean to pick on you, but I know you can handle it. But why do we need professors? If there's just a book, I can get. I had Barbara Ryden on, an eminent cosmologist at the Ohio State University. She's a better writer than I am, a textbook author than I am. And why not just have them and have a student and have just have the students teach each other, have them read in advance and maybe do some problems during class. And then why do we need to pay my exorbitant salary to charge, the equivalent of a Harvard tuition as well? What's make the case for the status quo, if you will, of having professors as necessary ingredients in the classroom?
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to make the case. First of all, I don't set the tuition, so
I know.
But I think, and we all know this, for really very highly self-motivated students, well, you don't need a professor. You don't need a formal class setting. And in fact, look, you and I, when we finished college and went on, or finished graduate school, given that we both became professors, that was not when learning stopped. It continued. You and I continued to learn every day, right? And we do that not with a professor. We do this because we're intrinsically motivated to learn, and we do it with probably even more satisfaction than we did when we were students. So I think for the most highly motivated students, definitely not necessary to have a professor. In fact, let's think about it. I'm going to mention two of our very successful alumni, both dropouts, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg. They had better things to do than sit in the class and listening to their professor. They decided early on that they were onto something that was, much bigger than what they could possibly learn in their classes. That doesn't mean that this is going to work for everybody. In fact, we know it doesn't work for everybody. However, I think we really are at a turning point in education with what is happening right now in terms of access to information through Google, which sort of makes the lowest level Bloom's taxonomy, remembering, almost unnecessary. And now there's an even bigger threat of generative AI, which is really encroaching on all of the other levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So I think we really need to have a discussion in higher education what the value is of higher education in the age of generative AI. I think there are three things that we need to realize. One is the introduction of any new technology obviates certain skills. I remember when the graphing calculator came up, people were in arms about students using graphing calculators in class, and even worse, on examinations. Now we don't think about that anymore because people would lose the skill of plotting data by hand. Who cares about that now? Or, when the HP 35 calculator came out in 1972, which is when I went to college, people were horrified that the skill of using slide rules and logarithm tables would be lost. And so each time that there's technology, there's a discussion about, do we isolate the students from this technology, or do we have them use it? And usually the knee-jerk reaction of most academic is we need to cut them off from it. And we see the same thing now with generative AI. So one, new technology makes certain skills atrophy. Two, new technology affects how we assess people. But three, and this is particularly important now, is new technology generally affects productivity and jobs. So, for example, generative AI is not affecting blue-collar jobs. It's affecting the jobs of our graduates. And just as robots have eliminated blue-collar jobs, so, signs are already emerging that generative AI is eliminating the jobs of our future graduates. And that is going to have a huge impact on us. So I think we really need to rethink the purpose of our education and the role of the professor in the classroom. I see myself as, rather than the sage on the stage, as sort of the guide on the side, the coach. Right? And think about it, right? I mean, most other things you learn and you're coached for, it's not the coach doing the work. The coach is letting you do the work. As a professor, especially in the old-fashioned medieval approach of teaching that you referred to earlier on, it's the professor doing the work and the student sitting passively observing. I don't learn how to play soccer by watching, soccer games on TV. I have to do. You learn by doing. Learning is not a spectator sport.
Hey there, students of the impossible Professor Brian Keating here. I know this is a bit old-fashioned, but I have a tiny little homework assignment for you. And that is to make sure you're subscribed to my YouTube channel and following the show on your preferred streaming platform. So take a moment to hit that subscribe or follow button if you haven't already done so. And for some extra credit, like the episode and leave a comment. Thanks a bunch. Now let's get back to my interview with the one and only Eric Mazur.
Look at the etymology of the word education. And, originally I thought it meant
out.
Yes, we always think of it as dumping into and forcing knowledge from my brain to their brains using the chalkboard and the pencil or the computer now is more likely. But in reality, I think it's has to transform. I mean, I do feel like our jobs were kind of miraculously saved in a way during COVID, because during COVID, there wasn't even the opportunity to have, in class, students interacting with students, although I'm sure you figured out ways to do it. I wasn't clever enough to do that. So it was just a torture. On the other hand, we survived it. So what is the, people always say, well, AI won't take your job, but somebody who knows how to use AI will take your job. But in reality, COVID kind of proved the opposite, or at least for professors like us, that our jobs are safe. They're going to be just the same as they were 1,000 years ago in Bologna, Italy, and we just have to keep the juice flowing, because until people find out that why learn from Brian Keating, when you can get a virtual Carl Sagan. We have every single word he ever said, every book he ever wrote, dump it into an LLM. And he could be up there and communicating and teaching far better than me. So what do you make of the resiliency of our profession and surviving COVID? I thought that would be upheaval.
I'm glad you mentioned it. I think at the beginning of COVID, I read this article by Yuval Harari, in the Financial Times. He wrote, I forgot exactly what the title was. It was something, The World After Coronavirus. And the second paragraph actually mentions, it's mostly really about privacy issues, but the second paragraph mentions education. And he says, in normal times, things like that are happening now would never have happened, like entire schools deciding to go online. I mean, no university, board of overseers or trustees or whatever would ever have decided to take such a dramatic experiment. And he also says that emergency measures often tend to become permanent because they fast forward, if you want, history. So I remember at the beginning of COVID thinking, wow, is this finally the turning point where education will get out of the Middle Ages? We know the answer to that question. The answer is no. But I think the big difference between COVID and generative AI is COVID went away. Yes, COVID exposed the fatal flaws of lecturing. It became deadly. Students were alone, lectures were recorded. Why even go to the live lecture if you can watch the recording when it's more convenient for you rather than for the professor? So, and then you're not only alone at home, you're totally alone because you're cut off from everybody else. You're really isolated. So I think in a sense, COVID exposed, the fatal flaws in the lecture-based approach to education. However, most people just sat through it, they bit the bullet and they continued. And luckily, the remote year was only 1 year and then we could go back. I think most people were thinking, I can't wait to get back in the classroom and do what I did before. And I think the reason for that, Brian, is that the lecture gives the perfect illusion of learning.
Yeah, simulation,
and
yes.
Because it gives the perfect illusion of learning, it gives the perfect illusion of teaching to the faculty members. So it cuts both ways. Let's go back to something else here, but it's related. You'll see the connection in a second. A number of years ago, I was organizing the colloquium here, and I worked very hard on getting the more attendance to the colloquia, my colleagues to come and attend, and I made nice posters, and I advertised it, and I made it a social thing. And, I pride myself in having invited quite a few interesting speakers. And, each time I'd look around, and it were more students than colleagues, and a lot of colleagues who I wanted to see were not there. And I remember sitting through some colloquia that I thought were absolutely spectacular. And then, half an hour later, I'm in the hallway of the lab, and I run into a colleague who I know has not attended the colloquium. And I say, did you come to that colloquium today? It was just phenomenal. And my colleague says, no, I'm sorry. I had another commitment. And then the colleague would say, so what was the colloquium exactly about? And then you realize, yeah, I know the title, I know the overall picture, but there's just no way I could reproduce any part of it, because it's focused on information transfer. That's not to say that colloquia are not good. I mean, they make you enthusiastic for different purposes. But as any type of lecture, as the principal vehicle for teaching, it's just not very useful, because it sticks to that information transfer rather than the making sense part. And that's where you and I, as professors, come in. We can help our students make sense of the material. And not by telling them, but by, designing activities that help them make sense of it.
I think I read in one of your studies that there's a tendency for a professor to answer, his or her own question. So we'll normally say, the expansion rate of the universe in the second Friedman equation, what is the dominant term, in the first billion years of the universe? And we hate to have silence because, as Jerry Seinfeld said, studies show that more people are more afraid of public speaking than they are of dying. So that means you'd rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy. And I feel like that when it's very uncomfortable to sit up there and just listen and wait when there's no responses. You don't know if anyone's paying attention, but you sort of suspect that you're a good enough teacher that, oh, someone must have gotten this. Even the dullest of dullards, would get something, and then they just wait, and then finally we give up. And the average dwell time, I think, according to your studies, was like 7 seconds. So it's well, the equation, right? Okay, yeah, it's lambda, it's omega matter. Okay, great, thanks. But they just sit there and they hope you won't call upon them. So I guess the question is, let's say I want to tactically approach this with the idea of improving my sort of conversion of information in my head or about the subject to my students. And I do want to use technology. I do believe, by the way, that we don't let students use their iPhones in class, or we frown upon.
I do. They can bring everything to class. They can bring everything to exams. They can do including ChatGPT. Absolutely everything.
Okay, great. I actually salute that idea. And but I want to ask you about technology in the classroom. What sorts of tools could displace that anxiety? They say that 18-year-olds go through kind of a withdrawal symptom if they don't have their phone in their hand. So are there ways to flip that around to use it in a better way that we could actually use it for our advantage?
Absolutely. So that's exactly what you need to do. You need to hijack the phone so that they're using it for a educational purpose rather than a social purpose. So one of the things you can do is you can ask them a question and have them record. There are plenty of different platforms that do that. Their answers on their phone, and then have the phone match them up with somebody else who has a different answer so they can debate their answers. Or, have them find somebody who has it doesn't have to be a phone, of course. It could be a tablet, or it could be a laptop too. Having them make a commitment, then finding somebody else in the class to talk to, and then they're lost in anonymity, right? I mean, you'd be stunned. It'll be very different from when you ask the question and hope to get an individual to answer you, which is very intimidating. Here, they just turn to their neighbor and they start talking to their neighbor who is one of their peers. There's no inhibition whatsoever. And within a second, the whole classroom is filled with noise, and everybody is, in a sense, anonymous in the sea of noise. And it's in these exchanges that you see the aha moments that should really be happening in class. Oh, I never thought about it this way. And now I see why I got this wrong. And then you can have them re-record the answer so that after the discussion, right, if they've not changed their mind, they answer the same thing. If they change their mind, they revise their answer. And you'll have a record also at how effective the question was in addressing misconceptions among the students. Now, you may think, isn't this taking advantage of the better students to teach the weaker students? Aren't we sort of lowering the bar? But think about it. In any class you teach, Brian, who is the person who learns the most? It's you. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So in a sense, you give the better students a chance to step into the shoes of the teacher. And as we all know, verbalizing our understanding reinforces it. So it's really a win-win situation. It's not that the weaker student benefits at the expense of the better students. No, both gain.
I want to now turn to the top, what I call the top of the funnel, and that's when we hire professors. And I remember a quote from Isidore Rabbi who said something to the effect of, we hire professors because they're good at research, and they are good at raising money, and they're good at either doing all sorts of other things. And if they're a gentleman, they also make an effort to teach. And it seems to me that, if you ask a student, what's the purpose of a university? It's to teach, right? So how come we have put so little effort and emphasis on hiring, good teachers when we really put this exorbitant amount of effort on a postdoc's ability to lead a project, have papers published and research, and we prioritize that? Aren't we sending the message up front at the top of the funnel in the worst possible way that teaching is because we can't vet you. We can't expect a postdoc to have taught a class. So don't we need to flip the classroom, so to speak, much earlier in the upstream than we actually are doing as professors that hire other professors?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, think about it. For just about every profession, you need to be trained and you need to be certified, right? An electrician who puts in the lights here in the ceiling in my office needs to be licensed. You wouldn't hire an unlicensed electrician and then have your house burned down. You wouldn't want to go to a dentist who doesn't have a license. You wouldn't want to be undergo surgery from a heart surgeon who isn't licensed to do those operations. There's a good reason for wanting people who hold important positions or who affect people's lives to be licensed. To teach kindergarten, you need a license. To teach in schools, you need a license. For our teaching, the one you and I do, we need nothing. Well, we need a PhD, and we're expected by virtue of this PhD to know how to educate the next generation of leaders of society. If you stop to think about it, it makes no sense. It's almost as if we're a cartel, and there's no accountability either. That is the big problem. And that gets compounded by the fact that lecturing creates the absolute perfect illusion of learning. It's like moving a mountain, but we should really be thinking. I mean, the literature is full of evidence that the approach to teaching that we've adopted in the Middle Ages, in Bologna, as you pointed out, where we used the Greek amphitheater, which was designed as a performance space, as a learning space. There's plenty of evidence that that approach doesn't work, yet we completely ignore that, and we continue to do generation after generation after generation what we've always been doing, because there's no accountability, and because there's no, expectation of needing any training. Everybody knows how to teach. You teach the way you were learned. You learned it yourself. I mean, you were taught yourself.
That's right, and I feel like there's also an erroneous conflation of teaching and grading. I'd love to get your perspective on that. Why do we need grades? I mean, I've often thought that why shouldn't everyone get an A, or why shouldn't, I mean, if not for sorting and kind of ranking, but look, I'm teaching cosmology. If someone's going to be injured because cosmologist gives the wrong value of the Hubble constant, I mean, we don't even agree on the Hubble constant as astronomers, right? So, but I can see it for a physician, and God forbid they graduate and they don't know the gravity of an inclined plane. Who knows what would happen to their patients? But let me ask you, why do we require professors to also be graders? And what's wrong with giving everybody an A?
2 points that I want to raise here. First of all, it is kind of odd that we're in both positions. We're in the position of teaching, where our goal is to maximize the learning in the classroom. And then at the assessment part, we make a Jekyll and Hyde transition and become the judge, right? So I can think of no other human endeavor where coach and judge is folded into one. I mean, society would revolt, right? I mean, you're a surgeon, you operate on, you're the one evaluating if the surgery is fine. If the patient dies, but the surgery, in your opinion, was good, it's good. I mean, that would never happen. Or you're a sports coach and you go to the Olympics and then you take a seat at the judge's bench. I mean, nobody would expect that and accept that. Yet in academia, that's exactly what we do. We set the test. It's almost like a silent pact between you and the students. I'll teach you, you'll tolerate my bad teaching, I'll give you an exam you can pass, and I'm the one grading it. You're totally right. We don't need grades. We don't need grades because grades focus the student not on the learning, but on the passing of the test in order to get a good grade. And you would think, well, isn't that the same thing? No, of course not, because there are plenty of shortcuts. A lot of things that we call cheating between the students, we tolerate It's completely acceptable in real life. I mean, when I write a paper at my desk here, I can talk to anyone I want. I can look up anything I want. And why do we call it cheating when the students do that? Are we
Right.
training them for the type of work that they will actually do by cutting them off from other individuals and cutting them off from information? So grades do two things. One is they make students risk averse. Right? I mean, if you have a high stakes examination and your admission, let's say to medical school or to graduate school, depends on your grades, you're going to do whatever is necessary to get the highest grade, including things that are not very productive, like cramming or even cheating, perhaps. Right? You cut corners. You and I would do the same thing. If our merit increase in our salary from one year to the other would depend on one simple, pretty stupid, high stakes test, we would probably do whatever is necessary to pass that test in order to get the maximum raise we can get. It's human nature, after all. So we can't blame the students really for that. So it makes them risk averse. And by making them risk averse, it robs them of creativity, an opportunity to be creative. I better not be creative. I better do what the professor expects rather than what I think is a novel and interesting approach. So we rob individuals of their creativity, and we rob them of an opportunity to learn for their own sakes rather than for the sake of passing a test. So I am totally with you, and I unfortunately I can't impact my institution. I gave a talk here many years ago. It's on YouTube. It's called "Assessment: The Silent Killer of Learning." After that talk, which was attended by about 300 of my colleagues, the dean of the college took me out to dinner, and he was so, riled up. He said, "We have to eliminate grades." Well, that was about 8 or 9 years ago, and here we are. We still have grades. However, there are ways around it. One way is to adopt something called specification grading, or an approach called ungrading. And we don't have the time to get into the details, but I would highly recommend anybody who is interested in it to look into those two approaches to grading, which is sort of an intermediate step between having no grades and purely narrative evaluation and the old-fashioned approach to high-stakes testing and grades. So ungrading and specifications grading.
Hey there, it's me again here with a fantastic offer for you. Do you want to own a tangible piece of 4 billion-year-old space dirt, aka a meteorite? Now's your chance. All you have to do to enter this giveaway is join my mailing list at briankeating.com/list. If you have a us.edu email address, you automatically win. Just go to briankeating.com/list to enter. There's no better way to learn about our universe than by observing and studying a piece of it, so don't miss out.
I want to talk about the other part of being an academic nowadays, which is the faculty side, which is tenure, which also I think the need for grading has a negative feedback impact in that, we want to be liked by our students. We do get evaluated from our students. I always tell my students, help me get a new motorized yacht, by filling out this form. I always joke about it. But I remember, when we used to do written forms back at Case Western, I remember my beloved Professor Philip Taylor, we do a written evaluation. He'd say, who would like to take this down to the wastebasket? But in reality, I think we all crave assessment. I mean, we're very high achievers, right? I mean, to get into the level of academia that you're in required, just incredible gifts and skills, and also extreme hard work. And I feel the same way too. It's not a gift; it's a lot of hard work. But now that we're there, we kind of want to protect ourselves, and we've made up this kind of moat as professors called tenure. And the only difference I point out, from the University of Bologna, if you teleported a student from Bologna to, San Diego, say, and you put them in there, they'd say, oh, there's a guy scratching on a rock with another piece of rock. Okay, I get that. There's this like really flat screen over there. I don't know what that's for. But besides that, Brian, student in 1040 AD or whatever, 1080 AD, at least I have the ability to go on strike, right? So the students would go on strike. then the faculty wouldn't get paid. So there was even an incentive for them. And thank God, I always say we have tenure now that abolished that barbaric practice of students going on strike. But tell me, is tenure also contributing to this problem? Because we're playing it safe until we get tenure. And then once we have tenure, we don't really use it. I mean, let's be honest. As a physics professor, I mean, your colleague and my beloved friend, Avi Loeb, or Lawrence Tribe, or Stephen, they're not going to get, fired. Stephen's very outspoken. Lawrence is very outspoken. But Avi, a physicist like you and me, we're not going to get fired for, we're going to, even if I support the heliocentrism, I'm not going to get fired. People might make fun of me, but I don't believe in that, by the way. But tell me, is tenure part of the problem? And it's encouraging, the kind of worst teachers rising to the top because they might be, entrenched in the tenure cartel.
I am not 100% sure of that. I think the bigger problem is really the lack of training and the lack of accountability we have. It's true that tenure is a sort of, in a sense, a very high-stakes assessment to pass through. But you get a lot of feedback on the way. It's not just that you work in a vacuum and then all of a sudden there's this high-stakes decision that determines your future. What I do object to is that many universities, including my own, have two tracks of faculty members. One focused on the traditional values of research, service, and education too, which is tenured, and then what is often called the non-ladder faculty track, adjunct professors, lecturers, preceptors, who do not have tenure and never will get tenure, who are very disposable, they get appointed and not, and mostly focus on teaching and often do a very important job teaching because they teach the classes that the tenured faculty members don't want to teach. What kind of message is that approach sending? It screams, teaching is not that important. The important part is the advancement of knowledge. So that, I think, is a major problem. And in that respect, maybe not giving tenure to the faculty, but giving tenure only to part of the faculty and not to others is a very significant problem, I think.
And maybe this is the last question. What if you ran a new university called Mazur University? What would you teach? What subjects do you feel a modern Renaissance woman should know? What aspects of the intellectual endeavor of Western or Eastern culture, civilization, or Southern or Northern? What would you require? What would be mandatory? And why?
I think rather than focusing on the what to know, meaning the content, I would probably very strongly shift towards what skills would I teach, especially now in an age of generative AI where knowledge and content are, rapidly taken over by technology. And I think what you said earlier was very perceptive. It's the people who successfully use generative AI who are going to take the jobs of others. And therefore, that's one skill that one might want to teach in a 21st century university. And I think the content is dependent on what the student wants to focus on, I would say. I would give much more autonomy to the students to determine the content and the problems they want to address. And also the siloing of knowledge in different disciplines goes contrary to everything we do, right? All the major problems in society in the 21st century are multidisciplinary problems. All the engineering, all the technology are multidisciplinary. When you design an airplane, there's chemistry involved, there's material science involved, there's physics that is involved, there's psychology involved, can you keep people, happy if a flight is more than 17 hours? Biology, you name it. It's a multidisciplinary problem. And I would say most of what we do outside of academia, we live in an ivory tower here, and we're siloed, so we can be perfectly happy in our narrow silos. But in society, any entity, any company, any organization is inherently multidisciplinary. So I think we need to let go of this grip we have on content, realize that by siloing content into disciplines, we leave a lot of important problems unaddressed because they fall either in between those silos or involve more than one silo. And I would really focus on skills. How do people effectively collaborate? How do people effectively use technology? How do we solve the problems of 21st century? And we have plenty of them, from the environment to conflict to energy, you name it. So I would probably focus much less on content and much more on skills.
Eric, it's been a great treat and an honor, and I want folks to know out there what an incredible scientist you are as well, leading Optica and the Optical Society and working on ultra-short laser pulses. Maybe we'll talk about that next time we ever get to meet each other, because you've done so much in the field of photonic devices, femtosecond lasers, even surgical techniques that involve the micromanipulation of subcellular organelles. Eric Mazur, Balkan professor of physics and applied physics. You're really an inspiration to me and many of the other faculty. We have thousands of professors that listen to this. I know they're going to enjoy it, and I just I really appreciate your time and serving as a remote mentor to millions, thousands, at least millions, maybe around the world. And you passed the test, so you passed the test. Thank you so much, Eric. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Great talking to you.
Okay, bye-bye.
See you. Thank you.
For the rest of you out there that are watching, I just want you to know, if you have a .edu email address in this highly educational field, I love to give these meteorites away. This is a chunk of 4 billion-year-old space schmutz, a meteorite impacted 4 billion years ago and has been studied by myself and others, and we're going to send you some information about it. So you're guaranteed to win if you have a .edu email address, but if you don't, you might win, and by chance, I pick one lucky viewer or subscriber to my Monday Magic Messages, which include amusing, some sort of appearance that I've made recently, something genius from around the world of science and education, an image, perhaps one from my research, or perhaps even better from other people's research, and then a conversation that I had, just like the one we just listened to with Eric Mazur, and there's many, many more. I know you're going to love my conversation with Cal Newport, who's also a professor. I have interviews with Steven Pinker and Avi Loeb, his colleagues, and I even have one with Larry Tribe, his very different impression on the channel. So check the back catalog. I know you'll enjoy it. We do this not just for people that can afford to be university students right now, but to really provide free of charge educational content to as many people as we can, because I believe that's my moral obligation. As a person whose education was funded by taxpayers, as a public student, and teaching at a public university. That's my promise to you. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Leave me a comment, review, thumbs up, thumbs down even, but let me know what you like and what you don't. And I'll always try to improve my skills as an educator and as a podcaster. Really, those are two similar things. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful day and keep looking up.
If you're interested in the future of education, I know you'll love this interview with Peter Diamandis. And click here for a playlist of the best episodes from the past few weeks. See you next week on Into the Impossible.